you for that kind introduction, Summer. And Daphne, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us in person after everything being remote for so long. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And a huge thank you to everyone who's here in person as well as joining us from virtual online. We're really excited to chat more today about not just Daphne's background, but also about some of the most exciting projects she's been working on. So maybe to start, Daphne, you could walk us through a little bit more about your story of how you got started and how you co-founded not just Coursera, but also insitro.
Thank you. So I have a somewhat convoluted history that started out being pretty straightforward. I was the child of two academics, and I expected that I would become an academic and that I would retire as an academic. So I did my PhD at Stanford, went to Berkeley for my postdoc, go Bears, and then came back to Stanford as a faculty member in 1995. I was working in the field of machine learning very early in the life of the field, so as it was becoming a field in the early 90s. And so I was working at Stanford as really the first machine learning hire into the computer science department, and became interested towards the late 90s in biomedical data, initially because it was just more technically interesting than some of the data sets that at the time were available to machine learning researchers, which were all kind of myth. So I began to work in that purely from a technical perspective, but then over time really became passionate about biomedical data in its own right. And so ended up actually for the next 10 years or so working at Stanford with a bifurcated existence where half my lab did computer science, machine learning research, and the other half did biology research, and my computer science friends didn't realize I did biology, and the other way around, so it's a bit weird, but it was fun. And I think really the most, I think the thing that led to the Coursera transition was an increasing sense of urgency to do something that had actual meaning in the world. So not just write papers and hope that someone reads them and does something with them, but really be able in a much more immediate way impact the lives of people. And so when we, as a result of a lot of work that I've been doing at Stanford on technology-assisted education, the Stanford MOOCs, the massive open online courses, launched in 2011, I looked at that and it was a real turning point for me because I told myself I could go back to my lab and write more papers, or I could go and really try and deliver on the opportunity that had been handed to me to make an impact in the world. Because all of a sudden, in a matter of just a few weeks, we had 100,000 learners in each one of those courses, and it wasn't just about the number; it was about people from every country, every age group, and really every walk of life. People in Bangladesh and Nigeria, and so it seemed like we had an incredible opportunity to do something meaningful. So I put my lab on hold and took what was supposed to be a 2-year leave of absence from Stanford, from which I never came back, and went off to found Coursera, and that was a really wild ride because not only had I never built a company, I'd never been at the company, so it's kind of like figuring it all out from scratch. But it was fun, and I think we did a ton. And I'll pause here because I could go on, but I'm sure you have more questions about Coursera or the first part, so I'll pause for now.
Absolutely. So many questions because your career is extremely fascinating in that it not only spans across academia and industry, but it also spans across multiple sectors from bio to AI to, of course, EdTech. So would love to hear a little bit more about some of your top lessons, especially when you were co-founding your very first company on the industry side, and any common lessons across these very different backgrounds that you have.
So first of all, I found that being an academic PI versus being an industry leader there are some similarities. So for example, an important component of being a leader of anything is to be able to create a coherent, compelling narrative of what it is that you do, what you do, and how it's going to be important. And that was important in my academic work, and it was definitely important in Coursera. Another thing that transferred over is that the quality of the people that you work with is absolutely critical, and having a group of people around you who are incredibly talented is transformative. Things that don't carry over quite as well from academia is in academia there's clear incentive for independent, almost lone wolf type of behavior. I don't think it's a deliberate thing, and I think it's shifting gradually, but there's definitely more of the, are you the first author on this paper, are you the last author on this paper? And so there is an incentive to have your own thing that you can take the credit for. In industry, it's the opposite. You can't really do anything on your own. It's all about being part of a team and what the team can accomplish. And that is a very different mindset. And I found myself really invigorated by the ability to tackle much larger, more ambitious efforts because you have the right incentives in place for people to collaborate. So I think that was a really important aspect. And then maybe associated with that is because you don't get trained to do that in academia, I found that it was really important, and I left it too late, so that was an important lesson learned, to bring in people who've been there, done that, because you really don't know what you don't know. And so having a sense of humility and realizing that you're only going to get so far by reinventing the wheel has turned out to be a really important lesson for me as I started to build companies and more complex companies. You really want to have at your side team members who can teach you the stuff that you don't know.
Thank you so much for sharing. And to follow up and build on what you've shared, actually, now that Coursera has turned out to be a tremendous success and you're continuing to build companies, curious if there are any lessons that you wish you had known back when you first started being a founder?
So I think the one that I just alluded to is, I think, one of the most important ones, which is at Coursera. I mean, we looked around the table at some point. This is about 2 years into the company, and at what was then our quote-unquote leadership team, most of whom had come with us from Stanford. And among the 5 of us who were, that group, there was a total of 2 years of industry experience, and that was kind of I think really held us back in terms of building the company right way. So I did not repeat that mistake at insitro, and I made it a point to hire more senior people at the beginning of the company, and I think that was important. The other lesson that I learned, by the way, which I think was really impactful, was the importance of culture. So culture is not the kind of thing we talk about in academia, and when I went, it exists, but it's kind of in the back of people's minds, or it's not even, it's kind of like part of the substrate, but no one talks about it. And if companies, people do, and I think they are right, and that was a lesson learned as well. When at Coursera, I was interviewing one of the first more senior people, and he asked me, so as a co-founder, co-CEO of the company, what would you like the culture to be? And I was like, thinking to myself, what is he talking about? Like, what is culture, and why do you need it? Do you come to work? You do work? You go home? I mean, what's culture? And I think I had a much deeper appreciation that I've acquired over time for how much difference culture makes and how it can ensure certain behaviors versus others. And bad cultures really drive bad behavior, and good cultures can have people do the right thing even if no one's there to tell them what to do. And I think that is so important.
I'm so glad you brought up that point, because you are very much not just a woman in a male-dominated industry, but also a female founder. So curious to hear, obviously there's a lot more conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion now, but how do you think about women in STEM and supporting their work, not just in academia, but also in the industry?
So this is clearly a topic that is very important to me, both in terms of my own experiences and in having 2 daughters who are, one is a Cal, and the other is a senior in high school, and I can see what it's like to be in STEM as a woman, and also for myself as a female founder. So I'll give you one example of the quote. They've been called microaggressions, and I think that's a pretty good term that I've witnessed. So for instance, when I was at Coursera, one of the times I was introduced to a Fortune 50 CEO, as the co-founder and co-CEO of Coursera, and so I sent a reply saying, we'd love to meet with you, and my assistant James, I had a male assistant at the time, would be happy to help coordinate, and his assistant responded to me saying, Daphne, could you please confirm James's availability for so-and-so? And you know, that happens a lot, and not just to me. So one thing that I always do when I get asked this question is I use it as an opportunity to have a call to action for all of you here, and I don't just mean the women, I actually mean specifically also the males in this room, which is you will often be the witness of these microaggressions where people go around the table and Jane says something and no one pays attention, and 5 minutes later John says the exact same thing and everyone says, John, what a great idea. If you're in that situation, it's really hard for Jane to say, you know, I said that 5 minutes ago, because there's no good way to do that without seeming like you're kind of asking for credit or, you know, being overly assertive or whatever. So if you see that, say, that's a great idea, John. And, you know, Jane made a very similar point 5 minutes ago. And if it comes from somebody else, it's a lot easier and a lot better. So I'm calling on all of you to be part of the solution, not just recognize the problem.
I really appreciate that you share such practical advice for things that people can do. And what about for folks who are earlier in their careers? I know we have a good mix of folks who are early in their career, who are still students or recently alumni, to folks who are much more senior in their career. But curious to hear your advice for folks who are very young in their career now as well. Are there practical steps that they can take?
So first of all, I think it's important to just have courage. Don't let the imposter syndrome get you. The imposter syndrome is very hard. I will tell you that I had it for many, many years, and so it's not real. And don't fall prey to believing that it's true. So that is one piece of advice that I would give. The other two, which are more life advice, is first of all, it's really important who you pick as a life partner. If you pick someone whose opinion is that their career is more important than yours, then that will become the reality. So it's important to keep that in mind as you decide who you want to spend your life with. And then the last piece of advice that I would give to any person at any stage is don't be afraid. Decide what matters to you in terms of where you'd like to spend your time, and it's okay to pay someone else to help you with the things that you care less about. So when my kids were young, my nanny drove them places so that I could spend more time doing things like reading with them. Because you have to decide how to balance your time. You can't do everything, you'll just burn out.
I love your tip on having someone drive, because it can be quite the pain now that folks are coming back to in-person again. And pivoting a little bit, we've talked about your journey to founding Coursera so far. Would love to hear how you then decided to found insitro, because it is such a jump.
So it wasn't as much of a jump as it might appear, because I had worked on machine learning and biology as in my Stanford days. And so at Coursera, I was there for 5 years, and the company at that point was doing much better than at the time that Stanford said, oh, your leave of absence is over, are you coming back? And I was like, I can't right now. And so they said, well, we have to choose, so I chose. But at 5 years, the company was in a good place, and I kind of started to finally lift my head above the trenches and saw that machine learning was changing the world in fundamental ways, but not having nearly as much of an impact in the life sciences. And I think part of the real reason for that gap is because there aren't that many people who speak both languages, and understanding enough to be fluent in biology and fluent in computer science. There's just not a lot of people trained that way, and I was one of the few who had that fortune to have gotten into both fields as early as I did. And I felt like that was a real opportunity to make a significant impact in taking an incredible technology and bringing it to a place where it could have an impact but was under-deployed. And so I decided that that was the next step of my journey, is to come back and really try and build a field that I've come to call digital biology. And the reason I call it that is because if you think about what we're able to do today by combining an incredible suite of tools from the life sciences that allow us to interrogate biology, measure it at unprecedented fidelity and scale. And then you can take the tools from machine learning and data science and interpret what it is that we're measuring. And then you can take a whole other suite of tools, like CRISPR, for example, and intervene in biological systems in ways that are also unprecedented to get biology, which is one of the most miraculous things that are around us, to behave differently than how we would normally, than what it would otherwise do. So I think this is a huge field. I think it's going to be the discipline of the next 20 years, and it's going to have impact not only in healthcare, which is where I am, but also in energy, in biomaterials, in agriculture, in the environment. There's so many ways in which if you can just get biology to do something a little bit different, it could be transformative. So I think it's an incredible opportunity. So if any of you are kind of interested in that intersection, I think there is going to be a huge sort of spurt of activity there with tremendous impact.
I think people are focusing on this intersection of AI, machine learning, and medicine for the very first time, especially since COVID, where a lot more people are paying attention. Curious to hear from your perspective why you think this is the right time to be applying machine learning methods, and also what led to you deciding that the right thing to do was to found a company, aka insitro, rather than continuing academic work.
So I think the answer to the first question is the one that I gave a moment ago, which is finally we have the tools at our disposal to actually measure biology and intervene in biology. When I worked in biology at Stanford, a large data set, this was 2011, was 200 samples. You were thrilled, it was large. And what we now have are tools at our disposal to really create the kinds of data sets that help us provide insight into human biology, human disease, and then also and data that's fit for purpose for machine learning. As to why to do it in a company, it comes back to my earlier answer about the difference between industry and academia, which is it's all about the team. And what we're trying to do at insitro, which by the way, if you haven't understood the illusion in the name, is the combination of in silico, which means the computer, and in vitro, which means in the test tube or in the lab. It really requires bringing together people from a multitude of disciplines. We have not only machine learning scientists, data scientists, software engineers, we have stem cell biologists, we have chemists, we have process engineers who build automation with liquid handling devices and so on. And it's an incredible mix of people, all of whom need to come together and work towards a common goal. And doing that in an academic environment, even putting aside the incredible resources that are required to build an operation like this with an automated factory, if you will, for doing work with cells, just getting people to come in and be aligned towards this is the thing that we're all working towards together is very hard to do in academia. Each one kind of has their own little empire with their own little turf. And so I think this is really, to me, why doing this in the company is the right thing to do, and why we're building what I think is a very special culture where people do come in with the recognition that they bring something important to the table, but so does everyone else around them, and it's different. And only by having a genuine, engaged, and respectful communication, with openness to ideas and insights from others, can this ever succeed.
I definitely want to come back to ask you more about the culture piece, but also talking a little bit more about insitro. Could you share with us a little bit more about specifically what you do? Because even walking up to stage, we were talking about your work in applying AI for drug development, but maybe share with the audience a little bit more about what you do.
So insitro aims to be the new drug discovery and development company that is built on a completely different foundation. So in some ways, an analogy to how technology-enabled companies in commerce or media or whatever have arisen that just use a different foundation than the incumbents. We want to use the foundation of technology and data science and machine learning to do drug discovery in a completely different way. So what we do specifically is we think about the journey of drug discovery from beginning to end and ask what are some pivotal decisions that are being made in which we really don't know which path to take, and maybe one path will lead us to success, and what is, by the way, typically a 10 to 15-year journey from I'm going to work on a disease like whatever, ALS or something, and a drug that you can actually put into a human. What are some decisions that we can make better by informing it using predictive models that are based on machine learning? So it includes things like, is this target, if I intervene at it, going to make a difference to human clinical outcome? And towards that, we bring data from human genetic cohorts, because the one true example that we have of intervention in humans that is truly controlled is, other than clinical trials, which are way down the line, is human genetics, where nature intervenes in our genetics, and that gives rise to changes in our traits. And so we use that as input. We also create a stem cell-based factory that takes induced pluripotent stem cells from people with diverse genetics and sees what those look like as neurons. And how does different genetics drive differences in how those neurons look, how those neurons function, whether they function normally or whether there's a disease phenotype. And that gives us an understanding of what are targets that we might want to intervene at. We also recently, about a year ago, actually acquired a company that then helps us address the question of, fine, targets are great, but you need to make medicines. How do you make medicines? So that's a company that does chemistry at scale. So you can generate massive amounts of chemistry data to interrogate whether different compounds bind and modulate a given target, and then use that as input to machine learning so that you can much more rapidly search through chemical space, which is 10 to the 80, which is ginormous, and find those interventions that are likely to actually appropriately modulate the target. So again, thinking about those different gating points where you say I can go this way or that way, and it's really hard to know which is the right path. Can we use machine learning to inform those decisions?
I'm so glad you talked about diverse genetics, because when we look at past data sets, women, minorities are severely underrepresented, and therefore models aren't necessarily accurate. So curious to hear how you're thinking about addressing some of that in your current work.
So that's a really challenging question, and I'm glad to say that on the human cohort side, there has been an increased emphasis on moving away from a Eurocentric approach for capturing human genetics. For instance, here in the US, there is a big effort called All of Us, which tries to create a human genotype-phenotype cohort specifically aiming at diversity. Even in the UK, which had one of the first and still best resources called the UK Biobank, and that was largely Eurocentric. They're now expanding it specifically to home in on diversity. The good news is that on the cellular side, there is a lot more options to collect cells with different genetic backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, and interrogate them, and that is a lot easier to do that, and we certainly have done that in our work that uses stem cells.
Thank you. I know we're nearing up on time, so one last question that we're hoping to leave with the audience today is, I know there's a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs or currently entrepreneurs in the audience, so curious, what are your suggestions or advice for best practices on culture building? Whether it is people who need to build their own culture, or it is someone looking to join an institution and want to assess whether or not it is the right cultural fit.
So first, I think it's just important to recognize that it really matters and that it doesn't happen on its own. So think about what matters to you, and with some exceptions, it's not the case that there's necessarily a right and wrong answer. So there's companies that are very confrontational in how they do things, but as long as it's constructive, that's fine. But maybe that doesn't work for you. And so you should think about what is the culture that is important for you as an individual or for the organization that you want to build, and then be very deliberate in nurturing that and making sure that it doesn't veer towards the dark side. So one of the other things that I've learned is that for every positive trait, there is a negative side, and that's, by the way, an important thing. If you're ever giving someone performance feedback, their areas for improvement are almost always their good properties taken to extremes. I'm not talking about technical feedback, but behavioral feedback. So one of the places that I think we found that dark side at the early days of Coursera is we hired a group of incredibly mission-driven people who are all about making the world better. They were all really nice. And nice is great, but it created a shadow where people were really afraid to give each other constructive feedback. And so there was this situation where someone would say something that didn't really make sense, and no one would call them out on it because they didn't want to hurt their feelings. And that doesn't create good outcomes. And so you want to be really thoughtful as you build a culture to make sure that you know what you want to achieve and to constantly monitor to make sure it's not going off the rails in the wrong direction.
And with that, thank you so much for sharing such a genuine and practical advice for all of us. And with that, a huge round of applause to Daphne.